You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You can find all your sales and rental needs for equipment at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You can find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Harold Holzer. Without a doubt, one of the country's best-selling historians, a leading authority, if not the leading authority, on Abraham Lincoln, and a go-to for members of the media when it comes to the intersection of politics, press, people, and history. He served as co-chairman of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, appointed to the commission by President Bill Clinton. Harold also received the National Humanities Medal from President George W. Bush in 2008. And in 2013, he wrote an essay on Lincoln for the official program at the re-inauguration of President Barack Obama. Are you sensing a pattern, a presidential pattern here? He has appeared on just about every major TV network, and his C-SPAN history lectures are terrific. He's written a number of well-received books on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era. If you love that period in American history as much as I do, Mr. Holzer's books are absolutely essential reading. Harold is currently the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute and the author of a new book, which we're going to discuss today, among other things. It's getting substantial praise. You can find it on Amazon. Matter of fact, we'll put a link to the book on our podcast posting. And the book is called The Presidents versus the Press, the Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media, from the Founding Fathers to Fake News. Thank you, sir, for joining us on the podcast, being hosted in the state where Lincoln became a man. At least that's what us Hoosiers like to tell ourselves. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. It's good to be with you from the state where Lincoln became a serious presidential aspirant, New York.
So Cooper Union.
Not to be too competitive, but yeah.
There's so much to discuss. I want to talk about your book a big part of the time. It's certainly in the news in more ways than one, and leave a little bit of time for some Lincoln discussion. But let's jump right into the book. The book is called The Presidents versus the Press, the Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media, from the Founding Fathers to Fake News. So let's not bury the lead, as they say. Okay. I do PR for a living. You used to do PR for a living. We both do a lot of writing. So if I said Donald Trump is the single biggest media hater, media suppressor, and most aggressive president in American history towards the media, you would say?
I would say, much as I'd love to agree, no, it's not true. He is, all talk and no action, fortunately for the First Amendment and for the press. He is the most insidious attacker of the press verbally, but he pales in comparison to John Adams and Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt in the measures he's taken to actually suppress the media. And in terms of his anger with the press, he's probably on a par with John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, maybe even George Washington. And so it's part of a pattern. He's the latest. But in terms of suppression, I don't think he's caught on to how we do that yet. So No.
So who would you rank? Who would you put on the Mount Rushmore of press media suppressors?
Well, one of them is already on Mount Rushmore, and that's Abraham Lincoln. Uh, for reasons he thought were valid. In fact, the big reason was saving the Constitution. He abrogated the Constitution in a sense by declaring that he had a war power that gave him the right to curtail freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And the way that manifested over the 4 years of his presidency was that more than 200 newspapers were shut down by the State Department, the War Department, the military, the courts, some courts, and editors were taken from their offices and put in military prisons in federal forts. We've never seen anything like that before. It happened again to a smaller extent during World War One, but Lincoln cracked down on dissent, actually putting bodies behind bars like nobody ever had or ever, hopefully, ever will.
You've written extensively about Lincoln and the press. And one of the things that I learned through your writings is that Lincoln was a newspaper owner.
Yeah, well, he was always deeply interested in the press, a subscriber, a distributor when he was a village postmaster in New Salem, Illinois, a reader even as a boy in Indiana, reading the St. Louis newspapers by the fireside as avidly as he read books, including the Bible. But yes, in 1859, the year before the presidential election, he found out that a German language newspaper, which had tried relocating from southern Illinois to the capital of Springfield, where he lived, had gotten into some financial problems, bad debts, and the editor's printing press had been seized. Hard to do a newspaper without your own printing press. So Lincoln and he made a deal, and the deal was Lincoln would advance $500, which was a lot of money in those days, to get the newspaper out of hock. And Lincoln would be the sole owner of a newspaper he couldn't read, by the way, because he had, much as he had tried to learn German, he never quite caught on. He knew a few words, but that's all. And why German? Because Germans were moving into Illinois in huge numbers, into Indiana, and swing states were possibly tiltable to the Republicans because of this new influx of overwhelmingly pro-Republican, anti-slavery voters. And the deal was, go ahead.
Is this where we should mention? Let's see if I can say it right. General Schimmelpfennig.
Schimmelpfennig, the late John Y. Simon's favorite general, General Schimmelpfennig. Well, that's another story. We can get to political generals for sure. But so Lincoln, the idea was, as long as this newspaper never varied in its opinions from the Republican platform, it could go on. And at the end of 1860, the editor could reclaim the press and be the sole owner. All it took was loyalty to the Republicans. And that's the deal they made, and that's the deal Lincoln kept.
So that's one member of the Mount Rushmore.
Right. Washington, you want to do him?
Yes, sir.
Well, Washington had a charmed existence for the first 3 years of his presidency. He was used to being treated like a national icon, and generally he was. But in the third year of his presidency, his own Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, engineered it so that a anti-federalist editor from New York would relocate to the capital of Philadelphia and launch what was essentially an anti-George Washington paper. And for the next 5 years, this newspaper and then a subsequently created anti-federalist newspaper, published by Benjamin Franklin's grandson, I should add, just did nothing but, it did other things, but relentlessly attacked George Washington to the point where at one cabinet meeting, he threw it to the floor and jumped up and down on it with boots. And Jefferson professed to be shocked, but he had brought the paper in. He not only encouraged the editor to relocate, he gave the editor a job in the State Department so that he would have enough money to create the paper. So it's an astonishing thing. But Washington was furious about the press. Now, in those days, you didn't hold televised news conferences and call the press the enemies of the people. It was a little more gentlemanly, and of course, we didn't have the media to do so. But Washington made it clear in his dealings with other editors, with other political leaders, with military people, that he was deeply insulted, wounded, and that he thought that this kind of journalism was the enemy of the Union, that it was giving the country a bad name in Europe and encouraging disloyalty, undermining foreign policy. And with his famous farewell message in 1796, with which he retreated back to public life, he made it clear in one of the drafts of that message, subsequently deleted as too self pitying, that he wasn't leaving just because he wanted to show a two-term example, didn't want dictatorships. He did it because he was sick of the malicious fake news. He didn't put it that way, but he just about put it that way.
Was the self-pitying deleted by Hamilton?
Yes. Talk about trusting the U.S. Post Office. He sent it by mail to Hamilton to edit it, and Hamilton sent it back by mail without insurance, I guess. And
we always say things are worse now than ever. Politics is more hateful now than ever.
Right.
The media is different now than ever. But one of the things that come through with your book and some of the other things that I've read about your book is that it was pretty darn brutal back then, especially in the 19th century.
Yes. So I think we're spoiled by generations of supposedly straight arrow reporting. But in the 19th century, the press tradition was entirely partisan. Newspapers were part of political party operations undisguisedly, I mean, boastfully. Republican papers supported only Republicans and made their news stories tilted toward the Republicans. Democratic newspapers did the same thing for Democrats. And when the leaders they supported won the White House, those newspapers were rewarded. They became advisors to the president. I mean, we all say, how dare the president call Sean Hannity to discuss policy? Well, Andrew Jackson not only called on the editors whom he liked, he invited them to Washington. He made one of them postmaster general. He made another controller of the currency. He had others in and out of the White House as speechwriters and policymakers writing his veto messages. This is actually part of an American tradition. We just don't admit it as openly as we did before.
That's a perfect transition to my next question, because I had written this down earlier. Several months ago, I read a book by David and Jean Heidler called The Rise of Andrew Jackson. It was terrific. They've actually have come on my podcast. I've interviewed them. I haven't posted it yet. They were terrific guests. But their book on Andrew Jackson they devote a considerable amount of attention to the rise of newspapers in kind of the early national Jacksonian period and how important they were. Do you get the sense in your research that that is the same turning point? You agree with them that era is really where the newspaper started to grow and influence both inside an administration and out?
Well, I don't question. It's a very good book, by the way. I agree with you. I wish I'd had it in front of me when I was writing my book, because it's really useful. They did great research. They write well. Yes, I think the reason why the papers became, exponentially more important in the Jacksonian era was not only because Jackson was an inveterate newspaper reader, consumer, and utilizer of journalists in his cause, but because of technology. So I think, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, equally devoted to the partisan press, but newspapers were kind of hand-cranked operations in those days, reaching not that many people, published once or twice a week. With Jackson and the age of the steam press, papers could be reproduced in the tens of thousands. And James Gordon Bennett, a political journalist whom Jackson didn't recognize for how useful he could be. It's one of the ones he didn't get. Bennett was a Scotsman who wanted Jackson to be his patron. Jackson turned it, but he still became a pro-democratic editor. But he eventually founded the most popular and influential newspaper in the country, the New York Herald, which up through and past the Lincoln era was extremely important. Yes, so I think Jackson's was not only the fact that he cared about the press, in which he was not unique, in which devotion he was not unique, but just technology. Technology makes newspapers more available. Were they less important in the Adams and Jefferson era? No. It's just that each copy was read by 40 or 50 people because they passed it around.
And public education was starting to change and more people were getting literate. I'm assuming
Absolutely.
that back then there were probably more young people who could read and would read the paper as opposed to older folks, whereas now that may be reversed in terms
Right.
of actual paper.
I was amazed when I wrote about the colonial era that there were more young people proportionately in the colonial era, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, than at any time in the country, maybe until, post World War II baby booms. So there are a lot of people under 25 years old. And yes, in urban areas, they had a greater chance to read. In rural areas, maybe not so much. Maybe it was the sins by omission of the fathers being passed on to the children. I have to go back and read their chapter, but I would say technology played a huge role in it, as did politics. Jackson understood the power of the press, the power of communication, the growing power of transportation, even though he didn't favor building better roads and canals and bridges, that he didn't think the feds should be involved in that. He and his supporters did believe there should be a network of Andrew Jackson newspapers around the country. And they did what they could to create what amounted to the first wire service in the country before there were wires, before there was a telegraph, and created an openly partisan ring of pro-democratic newspapers, which was extremely clever of them to create.
And forgive me, we are unabashed fans of Andrew Jackson on the Leaders and Legends podcast, so much so that I named my son after him 19 years ago. So I'm going to telegraph what I think should be the answer by asking this question, but feel free to answer as you like. If you could choose any past president to have a Twitter account, whom would you choose?
Wow. So you mean a president from a previous century to get his? Well, I'm an unabashed fan of Abraham Lincoln. That's my man. So considering how brilliantly he communicates and with what brevity he communicates, and aside from cursing, Jackson was not known as a person who spoke, whose speeches and written statements were brief. I would choose Lincoln. Act of the people, by the people, for the people would be a cool message to advance the Gettysburg Address. I think he'd be great at it.
You wouldn't want to read Andrew Jackson threatening to shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun on Twitter? That would be, that's catnip for the press.
Yep. No, there are presidents who would be great at it, and presidents. One thing is certain, and this is another thread. I think you asked me 40 minutes ago what the lead was, right? We did our PR professionals. What's the lead? So one of the leads is for sure what's old is new again, right? This has been going on. The other lead is that, to my point of view, and I didn't have Jackson in this equation originally, but certainly would put him in based on the proliferation of newspapers in his time and his recognition of their power, that the presidents who have been the best communicators are those who recognized and used the newest communications technologies available to get around the press. So by the end of his administration, when Abraham Lincoln was traveling with the Union Army in Virginia, he was sending dispatches to the War Department about the progress of Grant's army that were being published verbatim on the front page of every newspaper in the country. He was not only the commander-in-chief at the end of the war, he was the correspondent-in-chief, the communicator-in-chief. So that's one. Franklin Roosevelt, who held 998 news conferences during his 3 terms in 1 month in the White House and outside of the White House, at Hyde Park and Warm Springs, overseas, on battleships. He did have a press conference or 2 on a battleship. He also found a way to circumvent the press, and that was the fireside chat. 28, just 28. And if you're old enough to have parents who lived through that, or grandparents, to them, it was like he was on the radio as often as Jack Benny or Burns and Allen. He was a presence. His voice was part of their culture in their living rooms, and that was a first. Plus, Roosevelt had a third element, and that is the press protected him in a certain way. But we can get back to that.
With his disability, they wouldn't show
Yeah.
pictures. They wouldn't. I think the one thing that I had read that they were very careful is the fact that he couldn't get in and out of a car or that sort of
Right.
thing, and they censored that themselves.
It was self-censored up to a point, and then when a new generation of journalists got there in World War II, the press office ordered no pictures from handheld cameras, no candid pictures. Everything had to be posed, and if a photographer defied them, his film could be seized or was seized. I don't know if it could be, but the argument was we don't want to give aid and comfort to the enemy to suggest that the president is weak. But just two more presidents on this high-tech theme. John F. Kennedy did the same thing with the televised news conference, a whole new thing, live televised news conferences from a beautiful theater in the State Department. He went around the press with those, but they loved it because they got TV time when they asked questions. And then Barack Obama, to some degree, introduced the White House website. And Donald Trump, whatever you say about his temperament or his policies, he is an absolutely brilliant communicator. Not only does he use his Twitter account constantly, but the so-called professional journalists use his tweets to create the storyline for at least half of every day. He creates the news cycle in the same way that the Associated Press used to create the news cycle. Half of the day is spent reacting to his tweets. So he's pretty ingenious at that. And he's been doing it since he was a real estate man. In my book, I tracked his very first tweet, which he probably didn't type himself in those days, but it was tune in to Letterman tonight for my top 10 list. That was Donald Trump.
I'm gonna guess, just as a sideline, since you're from New York, you must have known President Trump for years, given your work in the art community and museums and all that.
So I met Trump a couple of times when I worked for Governor Mario Cuomo. Mario Cuomo used to encourage Trump to bid for projects in New York State because it would drive the mayor of New York, Ed Koch, crazy that the governor was considering him. So there was a big project for a football stadium for the New York Jets on the west side of Manhattan, which was totally impractical. It's now the site of this mega city within the city called Hudson Yards, to be built over railroad tracks. And Trump got into it, and he got NBC to commit to move Rockefeller Center, or to abandon Rockefeller Center and move to this new thing. And the mayor went crazy. So I did go to a couple of meetings with him. And then in my days at the Met, he and two of his wives would come every year to the Costume Institute Gala, the famous party of the year, which was the biggest social and red carpet event. And he was always scowling like this, whether he was with Ivana or Marla, his second wife. He did not want to be there. His brother who just died, loved it. He was there, loved going, but not Donald. So yeah, I met him, but I've been lucky enough to meet a few presidents, and I guess he's one of them now.
Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is author, historian, and friend of presidents, Harold Holzer.
I said I met them. I didn't say I was the best. Maybe one a little bit, but
going back, you mentioned a founding father, and I want to bring up, no discussion about presidents and the media and the press is complete without mentioning John Adams and the Sedition Act. Is that, in your view, the most pernicious piece of actual legislation aimed at not only the press, but it affected the press?
Yes. Lincoln's acts, however questionable, and the Supreme Court did decide post facto that he was not entitled to shut down newspapers on military authority as long as there were civil courts operating. But he was dead by then, so it was, and the war was over. It was, I think, just a judicial expression with no teeth. But Adams and his administration actually defied the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights said Congress shall make no laws that restrict freedom of the press. And Congress passed the sedition law, which made it a federal crime to ridicule the president of the United States. Adams signed it and just lustily enforced it, directed his attorney general, does this sound familiar, to go after people, directed his attorney general to prosecute journalists who attacked the Federalists. Now think of it. The courts of the Adams period, federal court, was 100% Federalist appointed, either by George Washington or John Adams. There was no dissenting on the court. So he was ruling almost monarchically. And there were at least 17 major show trials, following which editors were fined and imprisoned for criticizing John Adams. And that was the worst of the legislatively authorized crackdowns. But then you switch to the Espionage Act of 1918, engineered by Woodrow Wilson and cited as recently as Barack Obama's crackdown on two reporters, unfortunately with very similar names. It made writing about them kind of confusing. James Risen and James Rosen. They were wiretapped. Their families were wiretapped under a 75-year-old law that permits a president in times of national emergency to restrict the free flow of journalism.
It seems that the rise of the press and the antagonism somewhat mirrored the rise of political parties and the heating up of the rhetoric in the country in the early to mid 19th century. Papers became more partisan, their words became tougher, the insults became more biting. And that just seems to be what was happening in the country. Certainly was happening in Congress. I don't have to tell you about Bully Brooks or a lot of the other incidents that happened in the country at the time. Does the press mirror the mood of the country, or is there some other relationship?
Well, it's a chicken and egg, isn't it? Does the press seed the resentments, or does it report the resentments that exist? I would say that by the time that slavery became the big issue in the country, say from 1854 till 1863, the press was firing up the country. And the press was not just partisan by philosophy. The major press operations were basically owned and operated by political parties, or vice versa. Take the case of the New York Times in its original incarnation before the Ox family bought it in the 1890s. It was announced in its prospectus, we will be a Republican newspaper opposed to slavery. We will support Republicans. They said that in the circular they put under people's doorways in Manhattan. But more to the point, in 1864, the year Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election, the founding editor of the New York Times, Henry Raymond, served as the editor of the New York Times, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and a Republican candidate for Congress in Manhattan, which he won, by the way, all in the same year. Plus, he wrote a book about Lincoln, so he was also the equivalent of David Axelrod doing the media. That's 4 jobs in one cycle, and no one said this is not, allowed. This is a conflict of interest. This was the culture, but it's hard to say whether. I know I've skirted the basic question. Who made it? Who made the press hot, and who made the country as hot as it was, and up to the point of secession? The newspapers helped, but the situation was there. I don't think it would have been as widespread without mass communications, as mass communications could be described then. So I think they're feeding off each other at this point.
And people got more involved. There was more interest. The fight was so proximate. It was so heated. I mean, it's like watching or reading about a boxing match. You can't wait. One of the things that we assumed the Civil War was inevitable. I don't know whether it was or wasn't, but the country seemed to take on what did Lincoln say? The tug has to come.
Right.
It may as well come now. that it seemed to me that and I'm not blaming the media, but the press fed into that, like, let's just get it over with.
Yeah, well, the press believed in its advocacy. The Democratic press, the Republican press, a little more complicated because there was also a Southern press and a Northern press, and people were also reading the London Illustrated News, which was criticizing everything American. So, but it's not only like watching a boxing match. It's kind of like watching, trying to think, homies who are baseball announcers. If you ever get to watch a Yankees Red Sox game, I'm sorry if I'm leaving out an Indiana. I once saw a baseball game in Indiana, by the way. The Fort Wayne Tin Caps or Tin Hats, minor league. I think it's a B level farm team. Anyway,
because of the Lincoln National had
Right,
that amazing collection of Lincoln
they
stuff.
did, and now it's at the Allen County Library. When you go to speak there, in the days when you went anywhere, they put you up at a hotel whose best rooms overlook a ballpark. Not close enough that a home run could hit your window, but close enough that you could actually watch the game and smell the game and hear the cheers and the PA announcer. But if you listen to a Yankees announcer announce a game or a Red Sox announcer, you get a different vibe from what's going on. And if you read the Democratic or Republican press in the 1850s, you got that same sense of biased reporting, but happily biased. The way a ball game is called now, obviously more serious consequentially. But there's one of my favorite examples was the reporting of the first Lincoln Douglas debate in Ottawa, Illinois, in 1858. The Republican press reported that after he had concluded, Lincoln was carried off in triumph by his supporters from the stage. The Democratic press said after Lincoln's terrible performance, his supporters had to carry him off the stage. So,
is that the debate where the Republican, it might not have been the press, where it said that Stephen Douglas drools the saliva of incipient madness?
Could be, but I don't remember. I should remember. But it was certainly not Lincoln's finest hour, by the way, in the debates. It might have been, he was pretty timid. It might have been his worst performance. And his supporters from the newspapers openly wrote to him and said, you've got to be more, charge. You've got to charge. So his second debate was much stronger and much more aggressive.
So the whole notion, in your view, of people, these days, if you're a Republican or you support Trump, you only watch Fox News, and if you're not a Republican and you hate Trump, you watch MSNBC. And there's people who hunt around from A to B or other options. But that whole notion of people now only read what they want to read that agrees with them, that's historically inaccurate. And it's been true that people sought out the organs and the writings of people who agree with their views for over 100 years easily.
It just makes you wonder how elections were ever won. What is that middle ground that is swayable? And that's really what it always comes down to in American politics and in American elections. If you believe the polls that were printed on the day we're taping, only 5 or 6% of Americans are genuinely undecided about the Trump-Biden race. So the candidates and the parties are now going to spend about $300 million trying to get those 5% to lean a little harder and participate. I mean, they'll spend it on turnout as well. But I think that's always been the case. The only great realignment that I see happening in politics was Franklin Roosevelt's, well, it's not the only one, but it's an interesting one, was Franklin Roosevelt's brilliant effort. And he did this in part through the black press, which is a whole separate story in this book or any book about 19th century and 20th century journalism, is getting the black vote to change from its longstanding allegiance to the party of Lincoln to the Democratic Party. And, it was a fairly recent phenomenon. The black vote in 1932, in the midst of a depression that arguably hit people of color harder than white people. I say arguably because there were plenty of poor white people too in the depression. But the black vote was still Republican. It was for Herbert Hoover. And Roosevelt worked his tail off, as did his African-American supporters, to move the vote in 1936. And the black vote finally went for Roosevelt in 1936. And think of how that's in a period when the white Southern vote is pro-democratic exclusively, but also anti-African American advancement. So that was a huge realignment, and that was achieved largely through journalism, but the old-fashioned way, weekly newspapers. In fact, one of the reasons why there was no black journalist allowed at FDR's news conferences for his first 11 years as president, well, there were two reasons. One is that his press secretary was a descendant of General Jubal Early. I think that.
Oh, jeez.
And then the second reason is that he argued, Stephen Early did, that we don't have room in this in the Oval Office for every reporter who wants to come in. So we're restricting it to daily newspapers. The black press operated the old-fashioned way in weekly newspapers, and they finally broke that artificial ban by getting a wire service guy in there. But it's astonishing that the weekly press was still as influential as it was with people of color until the end of the 20th century, and maybe even today.
Our own Indianapolis recorder here, which does terrific work. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today is Harold Holzer, author, historian, and a very kind man for coming on the podcast. We're very grateful. I'm going to read a quote and then ask a question.
Okay.
Quote, the cheek of, you're going to start laughing as soon as I start saying this.
The cheek of every American must tinge with shame. Am I close?
You're pretty, you want to keep going?
No, I can't remember.
The cheek of every American must tingle with shame.
Tingle. I knew it was T-I-N-G. Okay. Go ahead.
Must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of a man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. That is what the partisan Democrat Chicago Times wrote about Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Well, obviously they didn't get it right. And the Democratic papers, as my friend Gabor Borit pointed out in his great book, Gettysburg Gospel, the Democratic press believed that Lincoln had used that occasion to launch his reelection campaign, because presidents didn't give public speeches. It's not that the speech is political, just read it. It's elegiac. It's a poem, but just the fact that he was appearing at a grave site of soldiers, which should be a lesson to other presidents. Not a bad thing to visit and pay tribute to the war dead, but we'll just leave the obvious comparisons alone. That was considered political. And in their defense, or in explanation, only a few months before they wrote that, the Chicago Times also, well, I won't give the lead-in story, but a few months before that, Lincoln's army had shut down the Chicago Times and arrested its editor, Wilbur Story. Shut it down. Why? For supporting an Ohio congressman who had suggested that young men buy the draft. Clement Laird Vallandigham. So Lincoln had shut down the Chicago Times. Why wouldn't they be ticked off at Lincoln? This was a war. It was a war of the press as well as a war of bullets and a war of words in every way.
And, well, the question I wanted to ask is, and maybe you can answer it about Lincoln, but others is, I've worked for elected officials and party folks.
Me too.
And they could be pretty thin-skinned. So how much, and which you can understand, right? If they're, of course, they love the adulation, right? It's Washington, right? He was spent his whole career starting, in 1770, 6 when he was appointed commander in chief, and he's just the father of the country. And you only say great things about him. He was elected twice unanimously to the presidency of the United States, and he's got some pipsqueak in the State Department, writing terrible things about him. He just wasn't used to it. These presidents, they're surrounded by people who serve them, who soothe them, and hopefully give them some straight talk. But standing up to the president of the United States has got to be tough. And in some cases, that's the role of the press secretary. So you've got a thin-skinned, maybe, who's used to being complimented, elected official. You've got a press secretary who has to establish good working relationships on and off the record with the media. Who's made that sort of mix work the best? I'm thinking John F. Kennedy. I'm thinking Ronald Reagan. Are there others?
Well, are we talking about presidents or press secretaries? Because I have never worked for a public official who quite liked the fact that a press secretary has to establish relationships with the press. There is a tension. Are you loyal to, well, of course you're loyal to the elected official. If you're not comfortable representing that person, you shouldn't be working for him or her. So I only worked for 2 really and loved them. Although they were, in his each way was not tolerant of criticism. But one, Mario Cuomo, had his own relationships with the press, so he would work his own early morning calls and criticism. So it was complicated. But who was the best at that? Well, Kennedy was great at it because he still palled around with journalists he had known for years when he was president, and they winked at his extramarital affairs. They turned the other way if they knew that he was taking uppers to get through the day and downers to go to sleep, and God knows what else in his cocktail of medications for his back. But he also socialized with them and had a really perfect press secretary in Pierre Salinger, who was not an insider, so was free to develop relationships with the press and a routine of briefings that they could depend on. In terms of presidents, I think most of them are thin-skinned. I mean, I think Reagan was thin-skinned. He just had a terrifically professional operation. He didn't like being criticized when criticism came to him over, the Bitburg Cemetery problem or a problem of his own making or Iran-Contra. He was upset, but he was such a disciplined person, probably from his days as an actor and also his days writing commentary for GE, where he knew how to do a 1-minute message brilliantly as well as any congressman knows how to do a 1-minute message. He stayed on message and pretended he didn't hear questions or looked at his watch, so he did pantomime too to avoid tough questions. So he was terrific at it. Absolutely. I don't know if anybody's been as good at that kind of deflection and humor since Reagan. I mean, Obama was pretty good, but Obama did not have good relations with the press corps. He just had a terrific presence on television, and he was a terrific communicator and eloquent as anything. But in terms of the working press, they thought he was secretive and combative and paid no attention to them because he was switching over to the communications platforms that he could control, like the White House website, like his own Twitter feed eventually. And we should keep in mind that Donald Trump, for all of his genius at communicating on Twitter, does not have the largest Twitter account in Twitter world. That distinction, I'm sure it galls him, belongs to Barack Obama. He has the most of anyone in the world.
Do you think the press, and it was said tongue in cheek, right? But those of us who maybe vote Republican or have worked for Republican officials who think that the media is not philosophically aligned with us on most things. Do you think the media took it as a condescending slap when Barack Obama said at that dinner, I forget if it was the press dinner or whatever, most of you in here covered me, all of you in here voted for me, or something like that, where he acknowledged the obvious that he received, this almost hagiographical coverage in the 2008 campaign. I mean, do you think the media is aware of that sort of thing and tries to compensate one way or the other?
Well, I think there is something to the press honeymoon theory, at least until President Trump, because he came in with such feuding going on with journalists, and that was actually part of his message, was that journalism is not to be relied on. Now, I think the Gridiron Club and the National Press Club events are just a hoot for journalists. I don't think they minded that. The only person I know who really, the two people, there's some great stories about it. Roosevelt once infuriated a famous columnist whose name I'm forgetting by complaining about something, and nobody understood why he was being so tough and so direct. And then it dawned on them that he was reading verbatim. Who was the famous Mencken? H.L. Mencken.
H.L. Mencken.
Reading a Mencken column. And as he left the event, Mencken turned to his table mates and said, "I'll get him if it's the last thing I do," because he had been made fun of. most of them are jolly affairs. And the only other person I know who didn't like being teased at a National Press Club was Donald Trump. And I think Obama had every right to make jokes at Trump's expense on the subject of birtherism, because that was a pretty racist trope. And he said something about Roswell, New Mexico was his next campaign, and Trump did not find it amusing. But the journalists don't care. They've had so much to drink at this event that they have to listen to the tapes 2 days after the hangover to get the idea of what happened there.
Well, and it's not the point of the podcast to go into what a lot of us on this side believe is pretty rampant and undisguised media bias. But do Republican presidents complain about that along with their other complaints about how they're treated?
Absolutely. Republican presidents do. And I've spoken, I just use my personal experiences, which are just reflective of my, wonderful opportunities to talk to presidents. But the two presidents with whom I've discussed this, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, were absolutely convinced that the press was out to get them. One a Democrat, one a Republican. I remember Bush saying to me, he asked me the first time I met him, he said, have you read any good books lately? And I thought, this is sort of interesting, because I believed the reigning caricature that Bush didn't read.
He's a voracious history reader.
Well, I think his wife was influential. She said, you have to read a book a week. And I said, yeah, I read, the most recent book I read was the biography of John Adams by David McCullough. And Bush said, oh, I read that. I think McCullough was too easy on Adams about the Alien and Sedition Act. I think he gave him a pass. He said, I've been mad at the New York Times, but I've never tried to shut them down. And then he winked at me. As you may remember, he liked to wink. He winked and he said, not that I wouldn't like to. Yes, that's his way of complaining. And Clinton, now says, and he's the only president I interviewed for my book, that he believes the press was only trying to do its job. But does he believe that it had any right to dwell on Travelgate and Vincent Foster? No, that outrages him, and thinks that was just the gotcha press, the leftover from the Nixon years. So the answer is they all have gripes. Some of them are real, some of them are imagined, Republican and Democrat. And they all have fairly good reasons, because unfortunately, since the Nixon era, the press has developed kind of a gotcha mentality. And we could argue about whether the press is biased politically. You know who the press is biased toward? The presidents who give them the most access and the least trouble. Somebody should learn that one day.
We cannot have any sort of discussion about the media and the press, the presidency, without mentioning Richard Nixon, who, if you have a chance, those of you who are listening, to look up an HBO special about the Nixon tapes. All it is Nixon's tapes. Yeah. And there's some written commentary, but the only voice you hear are Nixon and the people in the administration. It's actually quite apparent that there were 3 or 4 people who knew there was a White House taping system. Haldeman, Nixon, I think the Butterfield, who eventually had to cop to it at the Watergate committee, and then one other. But like Kissinger didn't know, all these people didn't know that their conversations were being taped. And in these conversations, Nixon is just unvarnished about his hatred of the media. And it was kind of 2 scorpions in a bottle. Clearly, they hated each other. So, one, Nixon and that relationship, I'm getting the sense you're saying that permeates to today. So that's A. And B, how important is it, because I'm thinking of Nixon and Dan Rather, how important is it for the president to have a foil in the media, whether that's Nixon and Dan Rather?
That's a great question. I mean, I think with Nixon, yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it's useful for them to have a foil. Nixon had one. I mean, Dan Rather told me that he thinks that's a mistake, that he made a mistake in speaking back to Nixon on his level. But John Avlon does it today for CNN. He does it. He tries to he doesn't mind fighting with Trump during press conferences. I mean, we've descended in terms of decorum at these events. So it was still a remarkable thing. I remember watching that press conference where Nixon said, "Are you running for something?" And Rather said, "No, sir, are you?" But this was a press conference that was taking place in a basketball arena with a crowd of people. So that was an unusual event. I think the foil question is great. I think it can be helpful. But again, what's really helpful is to develop an open relationship and one of where the briefings are trusted again. The best answer a press, you know this as someone who represented elected officials, a really good answer is, "I don't know, I'll get back to you." Nobody does that anymore. They'd rather fight and be combative and be advocates rather than the role that a press secretary used to play, at least when I was a press secretary, which is getting the information, maybe arguing for your boss. You asked another question about Nixon that I've now forgotten, but you know why the press resented Nixon originally? Well, not only because of his history of hating the press back when he was running for Congress, was prosecuting or persecuting Alger Hiss, depending on your point of view. He always hated the press. The Checkers episode, the fact that he was accused of having a slush fund to send out Christmas cards. Do you know how innocent that sounds today? But so he was always at war with the press. What emboldened the press was not that they hated Nixon, but that they helped bring him down. That 2 journalists could to change a landslide election decision and make it null and void based on their anonymously sourced reporting, and could then get 50 lucrative book deals, become multimillionaires, marry beautiful women, and be portrayed in the movies by Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. Everybody, I think, has been trying to do that since. And, lightning doesn't strike twice, especially in today's much more diffuse media world. There is no Woodward and Bernstein writing a series of stories anymore. No one has the focus for it.
Let's talk very quickly in the few minutes we have left. I want to ask you about, I was actually in Gettysburg at the Lincoln Forum. I met you, I believe. That was the year that Steven Spielberg was there.
Yes, at the cemetery, right?
That's right. And so you, when I've told folks that I was going to talk to you and mention that you were involved with the movie Lincoln, please tell us a little bit about that experience, because it's a beautiful movie, unbelievably well done. It captures the mood, I think, extremely well for that time period. It was a brilliant idea to focus on the fight for the 13th Amendment as opposed to some sprawling biopic. How did you become involved? And just talk a little bit about what that movie means to you.
Well, I think it's the best movie about Lincoln. That and Glory are the best movies about the Civil War. Maybe a little bit of Red Badge of Courage, which I just happen to like a lot. How did I get involved? I'm not even sure how I got a call one day from Tony Kushner, the famous playwright. Didn't know him. Maybe Doris Kearns Goodwin set us up, and that makes more sense. I should really know this, right? But I'm not big into autobiography. But so Kushner came over to visit me at the Metropolitan Museum and asked me if I would be an advisor and a principal advisor, so he gave me my own copy of the script with my name stamped on all the pages so I couldn't distribute it anywhere. And my job was to look at I wish I had it here to show it to you, but I moved it to my New York City apartment. It had a lot of little buck slips and questions in it. And here is my big movie, my one and only big movie deal. If I did this, I would be flown to Richmond, put up in the beautiful Jefferson Hotel with its alleged Gone with the Wind movie set staircase. And I would be invited on set to watch the few days of filming, first class all the way. And I get a call from Tony Kushner one day, and he said, I'm sorry, but we have to renege. You can't come. Daniel Day-Lewis doesn't want anyone else to visit the set. He doesn't want any modern people. I thought maybe there was a Jewish quota, and maybe Kushner and Spielberg were broke the bank on that. But I never got, my deal was never consummated. So it was a labor of love. And working with Kushner and getting to know Spielberg a little bit, Kushner is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met, not to mention a just brilliant writer, and did things that historians have never done. Not fiction, but real things. He's just amazing. And to just have been exposed to a year of being in his company and his email chain was a big thrill.
And did you have to step in and say, okay, look, this isn't accurate. This isn't what happened. This is what happened.
Yeah, but sometimes it made a difference, and sometimes they said, we don't care. I've told this in articles and in interviews, but the climactic scene of the simple matter of the roll call of Congress in the movie, they call the states alphabetically. How does I'm trying to think of a state that ends with A that starts with A that didn't secede, but how does Connecticut vote? There, I got to see, and Connecticut votes 5 for the amendment and 1 against. And I said to Tony Kushner, you're confusing the House roll call with a political convention. Remember those where the states are called to ask how we just saw it in the 2 conventions on television. And Tony Kushner literally sank out of a sofa in my office onto the floor. He said, "Oh, I can't believe I made that mistake." I said, "Yeah, it's done alphabetically by person." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes, I worked for a member of Congress whose name started with AB. And she was always the second person called because she was ABZ. And there was a congressman
Bella Abzug?
Bella Abzug. And there was a congressman named James Aboresk, ABO, and he was always first. And it really annoyed her that even with a name like ABZ, her husband's name, she wasn't first. Anyway, so one day he calls me from the set and says, I have to tell you, I told Stephen your idea and he doesn't like it. And I said, Tony, it's not an idea. I'm just telling you how it happened. And I just don't want you to get bitten in, I don't want to be graphic. I don't want you to get, criticized for this when it's so easily avoidable. No, it's not dramatic enough. Anyway, during the run up to the Oscars, Maureen Dowd wrote a column because a congressman from Connecticut complained about the way the vote was portrayed, saying Connecticut was unanimous for the amendment. And if it hadn't been state by state, nobody would have noticed this, the way it was portrayed. And he demanded that the DVDs, which Spielberg had so generously donated to every high school in the country, be withdrawn, or they had to be reshot. Anyway, Maureen Dowd of the New York Times wrote a column about how he had messed this up. And I still remember that we were together when he was interviewed by Maureen Dowd for his response. We were at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago for an event.
Oh, and great bookshop. Great bookshop.
He was so upset. And his quote to Maureen Dowd was, "If I had listened to Harold Holzer, I wouldn't be in this trouble." What he should have said is that Argo, which won Best Screenplay for that year, was also made up. There was no, if you remember that movie, there was no chase down the runway.
Yeah, there's no confrontation at the end. They
made that up. So anyway, that's my story about some things they listen to, one big thing I wish they'd listen to, but they didn't.
Do you have time to do the 5 questions?
Yeah, I'm dying to hear the 5 questions.
All right. Okay. So
You say I'm going to regret it, but I want.
well, they're going to be tough as hell for you. A couple of them are. They are for
I
all
don't
the
know if you're being
historians.
sarcastic or not.
No, not at all. The Heidlers struggled, and who's the historian? He wrote the book, won the Pulitzer. We had him on about the Scopes monkey trial.
Okay, but remember, as an old press secretary, if I don't know, I'm just going to say I'll check and call you back.
These are all opinion questions. Okay, the 5 questions with
opinions I can always do.
Well, a couple are more factual, but they'll be easy for you. We're talking with Harold Holzer about the 5 questions. Number 1, what was your first job?
Is that part-time or full-time? My first job where I made money was working as a roofer for my father's roofing company in the summer. I can't believe what a wreck I am, having lifted tar paper and roofing paper and cans of tar onto one floor because elevators end one floor below the roof. That was my first job. But my first full-time job out of college was as a cub reporter for a now defunct weekly newspaper called the Manhattan Tribune.
The author I was thinking of, the historian, was Edward Larson. This was tough for him. So we'll keep going. Number 2.
He didn't know his first job? Okay.
Well, just you'll understand when I get to 3, 4, and 5. Number 2, what was your first concert?
Frank Sinatra, Italian-American Equality Night at the old Madison Square Garden in 1969. I didn't see the Beatles at Shea Stadium, so I skipped right to Frank Sinatra. I think that was the first concert.
We have not had a Frank Sinatra answer in our
You're obviously talking to the wrong age group.
Well, we've talked a lot of boomers and heard a lot of Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Simon and Garfunkel, and
I know them. I knew them
Daniels.
a little bit. I knew them a little bit, so I didn't have to go to their concert. Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Mitch Daniels, who's the president of Purdue University, a huge history guy, former governor, former Reagan aide, and Booker aide. Yeah, he came on the podcast, and his first concert was Love and Spoonful and the Association.
Oh, I know who they are. And I know who Mitch Daniels is, so that's a trifecta right there.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you choose?
Yeah, these are tough questions. Scoop by Evelyn Waugh, because it's a story about how reporters work as foreign correspondents, and because it's hysterically funny. I think everybody needs a good laugh now, so that would be my suggestion of the day.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
I'm going to tell you my story. Can I expand on it a little bit?
Yes, sir.
I'll say exactly. So the answer is the Cooper Union address. I would like to hear Lincoln. So I was lecturing at a private school in Manhattan a few years ago, and the kids got to ask questions, and then the parents got to ask questions. So a man stood up, and the kids are in the front. Man stood up in the back and said, if you could witness any speech of Abraham Lincoln's, which would you like to witness? And I looked and I realized it was Jerry Seinfeld who was asking the question. So I said, the Cooper Union address. And he said, not the Gettysburg Address. And I said, not that there's anything wrong with that. So I did a Seinfeld line, and he was not happy. I remember he did. Comedians don't laugh at other people. I've noticed that over the years. Anyway, I said, yeah, the Cooper Union address. I don't want to go to Gettysburg and stand up for hours to hear him speak for 2.5 minutes. I want to have a nice plush velvet chair that swings around, and I could sit there for 2 hours and listen to Abraham Lincoln. So that would be my answer. If it's good enough for Seinfeld, it should be good enough for you.
And if you can get Jerry on the podcast, let us know.
I don't think he was too happy with me. So I don't think it's a relationship that continued.
The last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose?
So this would be someone with whom I haven't had a 2-hour meeting, right?
Correct. Living today.
Um, that's a really good question. Boy, these are hard. Um, so it, I hope you edit some of the pauses out of this. Um,
You know what, Mr. Holzer, to be honest with you, that's why we don't give them ahead of time. People are like, can we know the 5 questions? I'm like, no, just listen to one of my podcasts and you'll get it. But I want to hear people think it through, because some of these questions, especially for someone like you, a historian, it's tough to kind of think, well, gee, do I want to see Lincoln and Grant at Appomattox? Do I want to see, any
Yeah.
other Civil War thing?
yeah.
Lincoln and Grant at Appomattox is my choice. To see those 2 titans together would be.
But you mean Lee and Grant, I hope.
Lee and Grant, forgive me. That's right.
Yeah.
Grant and Lee at Appomattox.
Put Lincoln in there to screw it up by telling funny stories until Lee gets impatient and said, "Forget it. I'm not staying here."
He got impatient with Grant.
Yeah, he did. He did get impatient with Grant. Let's turn to business. So I will say, I'll say President Obama, because of all the recent presidents. All I ever got was 2 handshakes and never got to talk too much. And I would like to talk to him about his post-presidency and about Lincoln, because he's spent more time speaking about Abraham Lincoln than any other president. But I was never included in those historians' dinners he had at the White House, although some of my friends have, and I'm envious. So I'd like to have a recap and do one of the dinners with Obama. I'm sure I'd be very disappointed, but I feel left out.
Well, he's probably the most popular choice of that question, the most popular answer. Yeah. I'd kill to sit down with him for 2 hours and talk to him about history and sports and various things. He's obviously an engaging fellow.
The sports would all be about Chicago, so that would be a bore for me.
Well, my Dolphins were the team that beat the Bears to make them go 18-1 in 1985. And so, I'd have to bring that up, and he'd probably kick me out and I'd be okay with it. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Harold Holzer, author of the new book, best-selling, great reviews. The book is called The Presidents versus the Press, The Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media, from the Founding Fathers to Fake News. Thank you, sir, so much. It was an absolute honor. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you. And Ruth, I know you're listening. We love you. Hope you're feeling well. And thank you so much for helping make this interview happen.
Ditto. Thank you, Ruth. And thank you. It was great fun to talk to you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.